Okay, so speciation is when you form a new species, and this happens because of something called divergent evolution. Now, we haven't went in depth about that yet, but we've actually talked about that when we talked about Darwin's finches. But anyway, so divergent evolution happens like this. So you have this one species, and then it will branch off into new species. Okay, so this one here would be your common ancestor, and it would branch off into two new species. Okay, so this is what they believe happened with Darwin's finches that we talked about. You had your common ancestor from the mainland, and they went to all the islands, and then you had a new species develop at each island. So anyway, this is speciation. So by definition, that's the formation of a new species. So another way that speciation happens is when members of the population cannot interbreed anymore. So sometimes that's a physical barrier. Like if they went to the different islands like Darwin's finches, maybe they couldn't travel from island to island because it was too far away, so the water would be like a physical barrier. We're going to talk more about that too, what that's called. And then maybe it's a behavioral barrier. Maybe they can't interbreed because of some kind of behavior that they're not doing correctly, or a mutation even. So anyway, your original species is going to be called the common ancestor. So there's a few factors that affect how fast or the rate of evolution. Okay, so this is the speed of evolution. So sometimes evolution happens very, very quickly. In over a span of 100, 200, 300, 400 years. Quick evolution would even be thousands of years, okay? Slower evolution would be like more over millions of years. So anyway, these are the things that affect how fast evolution or the changes actually occur in the population. So one of those is population size. If you have a smaller population size, they're going to evolve a lot faster. Okay, so like humans have a pretty huge population size, so it's going to take them longer to actually evolve compared to, we mentioned cheetahs, which were endangered. Think of some other organisms that were endangered, like the bald eagle. They have a smaller population size, so they're going to evolve faster. Anyway, a changing environment. The environment. If you have a very stable environment, if the environment's not changing a lot, then the species is not going to change a lot. Okay, so if you have a changing environment, it's going to evolve faster. If you have a stable environment, then the organisms are kind of going to remain stable, and they're not going to change. They're going to change very gradually, very slowly. Mutation rate. When we went over mutations, we talked about some things that could possibly cause mutations. One of those things being like chemicals, UV light. So anyway, if you have organisms that are living in a place that is exposed to more mutagens, which are those things we just talked about, then they might have a higher mutation rate. Okay, so think about places where you've had nuclear explosions, Hiroshima. Remember Chernobyl? We talked about Chernobyl at one point. So those places are going to they're going to have a much higher mutagen, carcinogen presence. And so the living things that live there are going to have a higher mutation rate. So in those populations, you're going to see more mutations, which means they're going to evolve faster. Very quickly, you'll see which mutations were beneficial, which traits were beneficial, and which traits die out because they were not beneficial, or possibly even, made the organism less likely to survive. The other thing is reproduction rate. How fast do that particular species reproduce? At one point, we talked about fruit flies. Fruit flies are used a lot in genetic research because they have such a short life cycle, and also they have their reproduction. Their life cycle is like 1 day. So in your lifetime, you're going through a fruit fly in a human lifetime is going to go through, thousands of generations, whereas, for them, their reproduction rate's much faster compared to a human. So because they go through so many more generations faster, that means they're evolving faster, because it's from generation to generation where you're going to see evolution. It's usually going to take a bunch of generations to see the evolution. So if you can reproduce fast, you're making a new generation faster, so you're kind of going through the steps faster. So when we're talking about speciation, there's a couple different ways that can happen. But eventually, you get the formation of the new species from that one ancestor, that common ancestor. So there's 3 different patterns of evolution that can lead to a new species. Okay, so 2 species may evolve apart, not 2 species, I'm sorry. 1 species may evolve apart, so 1 species diverges and becomes 2. You might have species that evolve similar structures and appearances because they're evolving in a similar environment, or they can evolve together at the same time but not becoming more similar or more different. So we're going to talk about each one of these. I'm going to show you a little diagram to help you remember. So if you understand like basic vocabulary, convergent and divergent are opposites. Okay, so if you diverge, you're becoming more different, and if you converge, you're basically becoming more similar. And that's pretty much what's happening with both of these. So convergent evolution is where you have 2 unrelated species, okay, and they're going to become more and more similar because they're adapting to the same kind of environment, okay. This often gives something called an analogous structure. Okay, so a big example of this is going to be your mammalian fish and actual fish. Okay, so what I mean by mammalian fish is like whales and dolphins or mammals. Okay, so technically they're very different than your typical fish who is not a mammal. So whales and fish, if you were to look at whales and fish, you would notice a lot of similar characteristics because they're both evolving to the water. Okay, so the diagram I was saying that I was going to show you, let me move this over a little bit. So for convergent evolution, you're going to have 2 species that are unrelated, and they're going to become more and more similar. So this is a picture you would often see for convergent, 2 kind of coming together, becoming more similar. Now divergent is the opposite. You have 1 species and it splits off to become 2 new species because they become more and more different. They diverge, okay? So this is when 2 things, 1 or even 2 things is related and they're becoming more dissimilar, which is just different. That's all that means. So anyway, one example is Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches is a huge example of divergent evolution, and we've touched on this before. So specifically, adaptive radiation is a type of divergent evolution. Okay, so radiation, in the sense when we're talking about the finches, is that they go to different islands. They radiated. Okay, so if heat radiates, it spreads out. So these finches spread out and went to different islands. And then they adapted to those islands. So that's the adaptive part of adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is a great example of divergent evolution. And this is where you get many species coming from one single common ancestor. Okay, so again, this is Darwin's finches. Please know that adaptive radiation is Darwin's finches, divergent evolution. Okay, coevolution. So we've heard that before. It means with or together. So coevolution is when you have 2 or more species that are closely interacting, okay, and they're also evolving at the same time, but not necessarily becoming more similar, and they're also not becoming more different. Okay, so convergent, they're becoming more similar. Divergent, they're becoming more different. Coevolution, they're just evolving together. So what you often see is parallel lines with coevolution. Okay, or sometimes they even call it parallel evolution. Okay, so parallel, that's not great handwriting. Why does that look wrong? I don't know if I spelled that right or not. Anyway, so example of parallel evolution: predator and prey, parasite and host. Okay, this hummingbird and the flower. A plant is not becoming more similar or more different than an animal. They're already pretty different. Okay, they're not similar. They're not becoming more similar or more different, but they are evolving at the same time. Okay, and that's kind of what coevolution. They're both evolving at the same time. Okay, so maybe you've had a climate change. They're still both going to evolve to that new climate at the same time, but that doesn't mean they're going to become more different or more similar. So that's what coevolution is. So here's the pictures pretty much that I just drew, and just kind of going back over. So divergent, so that's where you have two species or even one species becoming more and more different, and then you get new species. Convergent evolution is where you have two species and they're becoming more similar. They're converging because they're adapting to the same environment. And then parallel or coevolution is where two species are not becoming more similar, not becoming more different, but they're also both evolving at the same time. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about speciation and how speciation can happen if species are isolated from different members of that same species. Like if the population gets isolated, remember how I said the water would separate it from the islands? So we're going to talk about specific types of reproductive isolations. Now, one thing you need to know about all of these types of reproductive isolations is you are isolating members of that population. And because of that, it causes speciation. So speciation, not always, but oftentimes is a direct result of isolation. They cannot interbreed. Okay, so for some reason, the members of that population is unable to interbreed. Okay, so the first type is called geographic isolation. This is usually the easiest one for people. This is when you geographically have a barrier. Okay, so there's a physical barrier dividing the population into two separate groups. Okay, oftentimes this is water. It could be a road. It could be a city. It could be, some sort of man-made, highway or something. Anyway, because you got to think, some things don't travel very far in their lifetime. Like a turtle, for example. They're going to be pretty slow moving. So anyway, a subspecies is a geographically isolated population of the same species, but then it develops its own characteristics, but it can still interbreed in the same species. Dogs have a lot of subspecies. Okay, that's why a lab can have babies with a Doberman. Okay, because they're still the same species, they're just different subspecies. Anyway, so one example is a volcano eruption. It separates two islands. And so now you have two separate islands. So half ended up at one island, half ended up at the other island. They're separate. Over time, if you were to join them back together, they would not be able to interbreed. And we're talking about a long period of time here. So anyway, like I said, water oftentimes is an example of this, like a body of water. Allopatric speciation is a formation of the new speciation through geographic isolation. So here is a picture of geographic isolation. We have my original beetle population, and a river arises. Okay, now you might be thinking to yourself, okay, rivers don't just pop up out of nowhere. Well, actually they can. Okay, so scenario, and this does frequently happen, if you are in the rainforest, okay, or somewhere where there's a lot of rain, and like let's say the humans cut down a bunch of trees, which is also a problem, deforestation in the rainforest. When you cut down a bunch of trees in a forested area, and it's going to rain a lot in that area, well, you have nothing to soak up all that rain. And so it's very easy for a small river to come up where you cut those trees down. The river is going to come in the lowest part. Anyway, so this is not uncommon. Not common in where we live, but it is common for other places. So anyway, you have this river, it comes up, and it splits the population in half. Well, over time, bunch of generations go by and they're reproducing and reproducing. Eventually, one side of the river you're going to have more certain traits, and on the other side of the river you're going to have more of another type of trait. And eventually, if you were to introduce those two populations back together after hundreds, maybe thousands of years, if you were to put those two populations back together, they would have become so different that they would not be able to interbreed. Because there would be so many genetic differences, and that's because they became new species. This is a picture of what I was talking about with the rainforest also. So you have your frogs here that are in one population, and then a river formed because we cut down trees. Okay, and so on one side of the river, you had yellow and green variety of frogs. And the other side of the river, you didn't have any yellow frogs, so they're all green. And then over time, those two populations became so different. On one side, you had all yellow, one side, you had all green, because the genes change over time. So if you were to introduce them back together, they would not be able to interbreed. And again, this is a long period of time we're talking about. So the next type of isolation we're going to talk about is temporal isolation. Another name for it is reproductive isolation. I like to think about temporal as time. Okay, they're reproducing at the wrong time. Now, one thing I want you to think about is we're not just talking about animals here. We're also talking about plants, okay? Many plants are sexually reproducing. Pretty much if it has a flower, it's sexually reproducing, okay? Pollen is plant sperm. We've talked about that before. So anyway, different animals and even plants, flowers open up. Certain plants, flowers open up at certain times of the day or certain times of the year based on the seasons, the weather. Okay, so animals are the same way. So they have different reproductive cycles. Well, if their cycles become off for some reason, then they're trying to reproduce at the wrong time, then they might not be able to interbreed. Okay, so if you have this one family of flower that only opens at night, okay, because the conditions that they have, maybe they have a mutation and they open at night, then these flowers are all going to interbreed together, and they're not going to be able to interbreed with other flowers like them because they're opening at the wrong time. Okay, same thing with animals. If this certain type of frog mates in the spring, but then the weather was a little bit different that year, and the others ended up mating at a different time, maybe they mated more into the summer or earlier, or even into the fall, then they're not going to be able to interbreed, and eventually they're going to become different species because they become so different. So that is temporal isolation. So the next type is mechanical isolation. So mechanical isolation, this is actually new to our curriculum, but mechanical isolation is really pretty simple. If you think of mechanics, we think of physical things. Okay, so this is when there is physically a difference in the genitalia. Okay, so like the sex organs. Okay, so again, we could be talking about animals, we could be talking about plants. So I'm going to use plants as an example again. Maybe the part that holds the pollen, the stamen, is in the wrong spot. Maybe the stamens aren't long enough to be pollinated. Okay, so mechanical isolation occurs to differences in size, shape, or location of the genitalia. Okay, so another example is two snail shells opening in the opposite direction. Therefore, they cannot mechanically meet in order to reproduce. Okay, so this would be a picture of what I'm talking about with the snails. Mechanical incapability or incompatibility of the snails to be able to join to reproduce. The last type is behavioral isolation. Okay, when I think of behavioral isolation, I think of you ain't acting right, you ain't behaving right. Okay, and so that's really kind of what it is. There's lots of different mating behaviors that animals perform, and of course this is going to be primarily animals, this type of isolation. But anyway, there's different courtship or mating behaviors. So if you have a family of grasshoppers, and they make the little grasshopper noise, the little chirping noise, and they have a mutation to where they can't produce that chirping noise. Well, that whole family is going to be behaviorally isolated from the other grasshoppers. Well, they're grasshoppers, so they don't care if they interbreed together. So that family will interbreed together, okay, because it's bugs. And eventually that family is going to keep on interbreeding together and not interbreed with the other grasshoppers, and eventually they could become a different species. Again, we're talking about a long period of time. Okay. Birds have a lot of different like mating behaviors. Birds singing. In this picture, you have the blue-footed booby. It's just the prettiest color, blue. But anyway, they're doing a courting dance and a pointing display. Okay, so maybe this group of boobies, this blue-footed boobies, maybe they have a mutation to where they can't do the pointing display. Okay, so that could isolate them behaviorally where they cannot interbreed with the others. If they were to mix, if a Van Cleve blue-footed booby was to mix with a Jackson blue-footed booby, okay, even though they're the same species, eventually over time they would become so different to where they weren't the same species anymore. Lots and lots of ritualistic mating type behaviors that this could apply to. The peacock strutting, that's why they do their feathers real pretty. That is the male peacock. Deer, we were talking about deer, how deer fight. Okay, so lots of examples of that. Okay, so this brings us back to natural selection and adaptations. So I did mention to y'all this is a little bit repetitive. So it is. Sorry. Anyway, so remember, natural selection is survival of the fittest. Okay, natural selection results in a species that is better adapted to that environment. Okay, whatever's most fit for that environment, that's what survives. Now, if you survive, you're going to be the one that makes the greatest number of offspring. Therefore, the offspring are going to be better adapted. Now, we're getting into the definition of adaptations. We've talked about this so many times. Y'all probably have a good understanding of adaptations. But adaptation, by definition, is any trait, which may be physical or behavioral, that helps the organism survive. I mentioned before, hibernation is an adaptation. That's a behavioral adaptation. Okay, so anyway, natural selection acts on the population, not on the individual. Okay, it acts on the whole population. It also causes a change in the frequency of alleles. Okay, I mentioned before about the peppered moths. So the peppered moths show back up here when we're talking about adaptations. Okay, so it changes the frequency of alleles. So going back to the peppered moths. The peppered moths are going to evolve. The whole population evolves, not necessarily the individual moth. Okay, because this is happening over many, many generations. Okay, so with your peppered moths, that was in England, they were all gray. We had a few dark or black varieties. The gray moths blend in with the tree bark. So that's what you saw more often. Okay, every now and then you would see the black moths, but they'd be eaten very quickly by birds because they stuck out like a sore thumb on those gray tree trunks. But then after the Industrial Revolution, all the soot in the air caused the tree bark to look more black. And so if you go today, most peppered moths are black because the gray ones got eaten then. So the natural selection did not act on the individual. It acted on the whole population of the peppered moths. And it changed the frequency or the amount of times we saw the gray allele or the black allele. Okay. Albino deer. If you ever see an albino deer, it's probably not very old because they stick out like a sore thumb. This is Mississippi. Hunting is a very common thing. I remember about a year or so ago, a little 10-year-old little boy was getting a bunch of flack on the internet because he killed an albino deer. And they were like, oh, all these people were saying that he shouldn't have killed it because it was such a rare creature. it's rare for a reason. It's rare because coyotes are going to get it. It's a wonder the deer was even alive because, like I said, it's white. It sticks out very, very much like a sore thumb because we don't have snow around here. So albino deer typically do not survive long enough to reproduce. You don't see them very much, okay? It's typically recessive. But anyway, you don't typically see them because they get eaten by predators very quickly. Deer are herbivores. Humans are not the only predator of deer, okay? So the albino deer, I'm surprised the kid was even able to kill it because, like I said, they're usually eaten by other predators because, I mean, they're very easy prey. They can't hide like a regular deer could. So anyway, again, natural selection causes changes in the frequency of alleles and makes you see the better adapted allele more often. Doesn't matter if it's a dominant or recessive, okay? If it's a recessive allele, but it is better adapted to that environment, you're going to see that recessive more often. And that's why when we looked at like the genetics lab, it might have been unclear in some situations which trait was dominant or recessive because maybe the recessive trait was, more common if it was more beneficial. So here, this is just a picture of polar bears adaptations. So if you really look at individuals, and especially if you live in a very harsh climate like a polar bear does, they're going to be extremely adapted to their environment. So some of the adaptations that a polar bear has is of course their white fur helps them camouflage. Predators and prey both are camouflaged sometimes, okay, because the predator needs to sneak up on the prey, and the prey needs to hide from the predator. So you might see camouflage adaptation for both of them. They're also going to have 2 layers of very thick fur and blubber or fat to keep them warm because they live in such a cold climate. Another thing is that they're going to have long curved claws that are very sharp, and that's not just for killing, that's also because they're having to walk on ice. Or else they'd be just, scrambling all over the place, probably what I would look like if I was to walk on ice. Anyway, another thing is that they have extremely good sense of smell. If you've ever watched any kind of like National Geographic stuff on polar bears, I want to say I've seen where they can smell prey from like a mile away or some kind of crazy distance. Anyway, because where they live, there's not as many prey, they have to have a good sense of smell to be able to hone in on their prey and smell it from a ways away to know where to go. So there's 3 types of natural selection. And this kind of explains like which members of the population is going to be the best fit for that environment. So with stabilizing, and I'm going to draw you little graphs for each one. The graphs really, in my opinion, help you understand what each one is. So there's my X and Y axes for the graphs. Y'all know I'm not good at drawing. Anyway, so stabilizing selection is where natural selection favors the average individual. Okay, so let's pretend we're talking small, medium, large. Or maybe, this color, that color, whatever. Okay, so with stabilizing selection, you're going to have a large amount of individuals that are average. So it's going to look like a typical bell curve. Okay, so in this case, you would have more average or medium-sized individuals or members of that population. So what if in that environment, if the insects are too big, they get eaten by a bird, and if they're too small, they can't get food. So the medium ones survive. And again, this depends on what the environment is. With directional selection, it's going to favor one extreme or the other of a trait. Okay, so with directional, maybe only the little ones, the small ones, survive. Okay, so you'll have a large number of small ones, and very few medium and large ones. Okay, so there's actually two graphs that you could see for this. The other one would be favoring the largest, so that was favoring the smallest. So favoring the largest would look like this. You would have more individuals that were large. Okay, and then so that is directional. It picks one direction or another. Okay, so it's going to favor one extreme or the other, either the really small ones or really large ones. Okay, so in this example, during a drought, food was scarce, so finches with bigger beaks were able to find food. Okay, so the small and the large, the small and the medium beaks would have died out. Okay, if you have mice, let's say, maybe only the small mice were able to hide from the predators, or maybe the large mice were too fat for the predators to pick up. Okay, one or the other cases. Then you have disruptive selection. So with disruptive selection, it's going to favor both extremes. Okay, so a second ago I said maybe the small mice can hide from the predators, and maybe the big mice are too fat to be picked up. Okay, maybe this didn't occur separately. Maybe you have both of them, so only the medium ones die out. Okay, so this is going to be a U-shaped, or kind of like an inverted bell curve graph. So those are the three kind of trends that you could possibly see with natural selection. Either it's going to favor the average individual, okay, one extreme or the other, or both extremes. So this is kind of what basically I was just showing you. So to be able to identify on these graphs what you're looking at here. Okay, so this is another picture. So this would all be stabilizing because it's favoring the average or the middle. Again, you see that bell-shaped curve there. Okay, so internal versus external fertilization. Okay, so some animals do external fertilization. So for humans, we do internal fertilization. So this is basically when the sperm and egg comes together. Okay, it either comes together outside of the body or inside of the body. So humans, y'all are probably more familiar with that. The sperm and egg come together on the inside of the body. So that's internal fertilization. When you have internal fertilization, you have a smaller number of eggs and sperm because they're more likely to survive. So this is an advantage. External fertilization, like fish, fish are going to, you ever heard of caviar? That's fish eggs. Okay, it's the eggs, not fish babies. Okay, because what happens is the eggs are released into the water, okay, by the females, and then the sperm is released into the water by the males. Okay, well, water is fluid. They may not necessarily come together, the egg and sperm. So you have to have a large number of egg and sperm because most of the eggs will not meet the sperm. They will not be fertilized. Okay, and even then, they don't have a high survival rate. They might be eaten by predators, or, you know, they just might not survive for whatever reason. So external fertilization is going to produce a lot more egg and sperm, but they're less likely to be fertilized, so it's more of a disadvantage. Okay, so we talked earlier about adaptations. Now we're going to name some. So I told you there are some behavioral adaptations, and then there are some physical adaptations. So behavioral adaptations, here's lots of examples of those. Okay, mating rituals. We talked about some mating rituals when we were talking about isolation, behavioral isolation. Those same things can also be adaptations. So the male peacock strutting, the mating rituals with where they fight, the deer with the antlers and they rut. The blue-footed booby that we looked at with the dancing and the pointing, or the birds singing, or the grasshoppers making their little crickets and the chirping and all that. Another example of a behavioral adaptation is hibernation. I think most people are familiar with hibernation. We don't really have a lot of animals that are going to hibernate in our area because we have a pretty mild climate. Hibernation is going to be more for animals that live a little further north than us, where they really have 4 seasons. Our seasons are not as distinctive as if you were to go, into Tennessee, for example. So anyway, hibernation, these are animals that don't live in large groups, and they hibernate because they're not necessarily going to survive easily in the colder conditions. Okay, so hibernation is typically going to happen in the cold, and this is usually going to be warm-blooded, a cold climate, but warm-blooded animals. Okay. Anyway, so a cool thing about hibernation is everything slows down. They're not moving around so much, so everything slows down. Their digestion slows down, so they don't eat as much. Their breathing slows down. Their heart rate, because they're not eating as much and breathing as much, their metabolism slows down. So, estivation. Okay, estivation is like hibernation, except it's during hot weather, okay, and it's for cold-blooded things. Okay, it's cold-blooded things like amphibians, reptiles, mostly are what's going to go through estivation. So think like fish, frogs, snakes, they go through estivations. You ever wonder why snakes go in holes? It's because the dirt is cold, okay, it's colder. They are cold-blooded, so their temperature is regulated by the temperature of their environment. Okay, and because the temperature of their environment gets very, very hot, well, then they get too hot and they can die. So they estivate. So they conserve energy. They go in a hole, usually. Sometimes that hole's underwater. So they conserve energy because they're slowing down their heartbeat, their breathing. They don't eat as much. When like certain things estivate, they can use 90 to 95% less energy. So it's a significant decrease. So here's an example of a cute little thing hibernating. And then you have lots of things estivating here. Notice they're pretty much going in holes, and they're all reptiles or amphibians. And they're going into that dirt because it's a little colder than what it would be up top. Migration. So migration is the moving of an animal from one region to another. They're usually seasonal travel, and they're trying to find a better environment, okay, a more environment they like better. A lot of times this is animals that are easy to, travel. Birds do this. Hummingbirds are big to do this. We see this. Hummingbirds come through at certain times of the year. Love bugs, okay. Whales do this. They migrate. This is why if you ever go to an area where whale watching is popular, it's only during certain times of the year. Okay. So anyway, you've all probably heard birds fly south for the winter. It's because it's cold in the winter. And so they fly south to get to a better environment. So migration is a behavioral adaptation, a way that they can better survive. So then you have social grouping. You've probably heard of social grouping. You probably heard of animals that social group, but you might not have realized that's what it was. Social grouping is when animals live like in a hive, like bees. They live in a hive, or hornet's nest, for example. One bee, not that scary. A couple hundred bees, it was going to be very scary. So, like the bees that live in the hive, it's to help defend themselves and also to help them get food. And you have different bees that, some may be defender bees, some may be, food collecting bees. This can be a disadvantage because they're all living in one spot. So if you have a hurricane or, a bad storm or a fire or some kind of disaster or even a disease that hits the whole hive, then the whole entire hive could be killed. You got a picture of the meerkats here from that TV show. Lions live in a pride. Wolves live in a pack. So social grouping is a very common thing. So here's a picture of a crocodile that's very adapted to being a predator, but also living in the water. Okay, so you can see the nose is on top of the head so that they can poke just the very top of their head out and still breathe. And their eyes are on top of the head because you remember crocodiles are very sneaky and they're scary. Ugh. Okay, so here's a picture of Darwin's finches, and again, they are adapted to their food source based on their beaks. So it's just another picture similar to the previous one we looked at. Okay, so adaptations for protection. Okay, so some adaptations are to help protect from a predator. So one of those is protective coloring. Protective coloring includes camouflage, but also something called warning coloration. So camouflage, I think we all have a basic understanding that that is to help it blend in with its environment. Now, camouflage is protective, but it's for prey, but it's also for predators too. Okay, so here you have a flounder that is camouflaged into the sand. And there's lots of examples of camouflage. Anyway, warning coloration, that would be this skunk here. Or if you've ever seen the brightly colored, like red and yellow frogs, or red, like a ladybug is actually warning coloration, because if eaten by certain other insects, it's toxic, okay? So anyway, warning coloration is to scare off other things, because maybe it's venomous, maybe it's a skunk and it's going to spray you. Okay, so the bright colors typically mean there's some sort of danger. Maybe not towards you as a human, but maybe towards, you know, a butterfly or another animal that's going to eat it. Okay, so here are some examples of camouflage. You can pause if you want to look closer. And here are some examples of warning coloration. Again, you can pause if you want to look closer. Again, these things may not be dangerous to you. Well, some of them are, but some of them might be dangerous if eaten by another animal. Protective resemblance is another example. There's two types of this. So one of them is mimicry. The other is self-mimicry. So mimicry, again, these are all adaptations. Mimicry basically is when you copy, when you're a non-dangerous species, but you copy the look of a dangerous species. Okay, a second ago I showed you a picture of a butterfly. Okay, there's two types of butterflies that look very similar. One is the monarch, one is the viceroy. The monarch tastes very nasty to things that eat the monarch. The viceroy does not, but they look so similar, animals don't know the difference, so they leave both of them alone. That is mimicry. Another one is the snakes here. Okay, this is the coral snake, which is very venomous and can kill you, one of the most dangerous snakes. And then the king snake, which is non-venomous. They do live in the same areas too. So as humans, we know if red touches black, you're okay, Jack. But if red touches yellow, you're a dead fella. Animals don't know that, so they leave both of them alone. Now, if I'm a hawk, I'm not going to get either one of them because they look so similar. I don't know which is which, and I don't want to die, so I'm just going to leave it alone. Self-mimicry, you see this in insects sometimes, and this is where like the head of the insect might look like the butt. Okay, and that kind of it sounds weird, but let me show you a picture. Okay, so if you look here at the self-mimicry right here, okay, if I'm a predator, I don't want to sneak up on the head. I want to sneak up behind it. But the butt looks kind of like the head, so it's going to avoid being eaten because of that. Anyway, here's some more self-mimicry with the owl here. You can't tell if you're looking at the front or the back. Again, you don't want to sneak up on it. And then there's your picture of the viceroy and the monarch. Animals aren't going to know that difference. And then just some other organisms. Plants are also adapted too. Okay, one of the biggest adaptations of plants are flowers. Okay, because of flowers, plants became very widespread. So anyway, angiosperms are another name for flowering plants, and how they spread out their seeds are an adaptation. So one way is wind. Okay, dandelions, you know this is a dandelion down here. And that when you blow the dandelion, that's going to spread hundreds of seeds. So, another thing that does this is maple trees. There's also hooks that can hook into, like little pokey things that can hook into an animal. And when it hooks into that animal's going to walk somewhere else and spread that seed of that plant somewhere else. Okay, so this would be like hooks. So think about the little things that if you go outside, sometimes they stick in your sock. It doesn't happen every time you go walk out in the grass because not every yard has these. Another thing is fruit. Fruits are a major adaptation for plants. Now, you only get fruit from a flowering plant. The fruit comes after the flower. But anyway, what happens with an animal, the animal eats the whole fruit, including the seeds. Okay, so like even an apple, they're going to eat the seeds and the core of the apple, or an orange, or whatever they're eating, whatever the fruit is, they're going to eat the seeds too. When they eat those seeds, they eat them whole. They're going to, move around at some point because they're animals, and then they're going to poop. When they poop somewhere, they're pooping out those seeds. Well, the poop provides fertilizer, but it's also dispersed the seeds to a new location further away from the parent so that the baby plant does not have to compete with the parent plant. Because remember, plants will compete for space, for sunlight, for water, for nutrients in the soil. So this dispersal is a major plant adaptation. Okay, so that leads us to finishing out our evolution notes. So we mentioned before that you either adapt or die. Well, if organisms are not suited for that environment for survival and they do not survive, they can become endangered and then they can become extinct. And if they're extinct, they will be replaced by a species that is better fit for that environment. Okay, so here we have our dinosaurs here. Okay, it's not E equals MC 10, it's E equals MC squared. Okay, anyway, so over long periods of time, different events can happen, like climate change or various natural disasters that can cause species to become extinct because they did not adapt to their new condition, maybe their new climate or after the natural disaster. Okay, so what's going to happen is when the dinosaurs were extinct, when they disappeared, we had mammals and birds take over their place as the dominant organisms on Earth. So lastly, populations are going to continually change because of these reasons. Overpopulation. If there's more offspring produced because of good conditions, eventually you have too many. Well, that will lead to competition. Competition is going to be when populations compete with each other. Maybe the same species, the same population competes, or maybe it's different species, different populations competing. Maybe the squirrels are competing with the birds for the same food source. Then that gets you to survival of the fittest and natural selection. The ones that are better suited to that environment will survive. Okay? So those that survive will then reproduce. If you get to survive, you get to reproduce. Your genes get passed on. Okay? And then lastly, all these things will ultimately lead to speciation, which is going to change that population and make new species. So this is just a picture of all those things we just talked about. Anyway, so that concludes this portion of your evolution notes. So hopefully this helped you out. Please be on the lookout for the next videos in the evolution series because we are not done yet.